Hey now, Brawlers, it's time for another Board Game Brawl review with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com.
Alright, today we're going to take a look at Evolution from North Star Games. Now, a brief history of Evolution. It was originally what I believe, much smaller card game from a Russian publisher and designer before it was eventually picked up by North Star and totally revamped with new artwork. It was on Kickstarter and was a very, very big success. And I think while it retains the core traits of the original game, it was modified in quite a few ways, including especially the artwork and the production values. Now, I should also note that at the time I'm publishing this video, there is a Kickstarter that is ongoing right now for a new second edition of Evolution, together with a new expansion, which is very odd. Not the expansion. I go into more detail about this on my Kickstarter update, so I'm not going to belabor the point here, but this was just on Kickstarter for the first edition, well, the first new edition, less than a year ago, and it's only hit retail like 6 months ago, so it's very odd. But suffice to say, this is for the first edition rules. I don't have the second edition rules. I'm not interested in playing with the second edition rules yet. I just wanted to review the first edition rules and see how I liked it. Now, what is this game for the uninitiated? This is a card game, essentially, with some little bits and boards that your tokens that you're keeping track of, but it's supposed to simulate you taking control of a species. Think of something like the game Spore, the computer game Spore. You take a species and you raise it up, you give it more traits, you evolve it over time, and sometimes the traits are kind of wacky and it doesn't really make sense together, but you're just trying to make yourself the best creature possible. You're either going to be an herbivore or a carnivore. Feeding is the main thing that's going to happen in this game, and it's one of the main ways that you're going to be getting points, as well as trying to have the most species and trying to have really powerful and evolved species. All of these things are going to be getting you points. Let's go ahead and take a brief look at how the game is played. That's probably the best way to explain it. Then we're going to come back. I'll let you know what I think. Okay, Evolution is a competitive game for up to 6 players. The goal of the game is to have the most points at the end. You're going to determine points by how many species you have in front of you. A species is a species if you have its board in front of you. So in this case, I would have 2 species, but you start the game off with only 1. You're going to be able to get more during the course of the game. So every one of those at the end that you still have alive is going to be worth a point. Every one of these food tokens, which come in both herbivore and carnivore variety, these are animal limbs, they're kind of hard to see, but every one of those that you have in your food token bag at the end of the game, every player gets one of these food token bags, is going to be worth a point, every one of those that you have. And then also every trait card that you have on one of your species that they've actually evolved with is going to be worth a point at the end of the game. You can have a limit of 3 trait cards on every one of your species. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about just how you play the game. So at the beginning of the game, every player is going to have a food token bag. They're going to have their species. You have 2 different things that you keep track of here. You have population and body size. And you'll have these little brown markers that you use to keep track of, and you have more off to the side for when you get more species. This is actually the first player marker, believe it or not, which I actually kind of dig. And that will pass around every round so that different people will have a chance to go first and therefore last. Every player also starts off with 3 cards plus 1 for every species that they have. So in other words, at the start of the game, you're going to have 4 cards. From then on, you may have more than 4 cards, actually, because you may gain more and more species, but you're always going to get at least 3 plus your species. Now, after everyone gets their cards for the round, then you have to supply the watering hole with food, which is sort of a meta thing that all the players have to do. They have to take 1 card from their hand and they have to put it face down onto the watering hole. Once everyone has done that, then you're going to flip all the cards over and look at the bottom corner of the trait cards, and that number is going to tell you how much food is going to be added to the watering hole. And sometimes that number is actually a negative number, but you're going to add or subtract all those numbers on all the food cards that have been submitted into the watering hole, and then put out that many food tokens. So let's just say it was this many, or this many, whatever it might be. So it doesn't really matter if these are flipped over to what side. It only matters if you really want to keep track on your own player boards who's a carnivore and who's not. Now you're going to go in turn order and you're going to play those cards that you have from before. But you have actually 4 different ways that you can choose to play those cards. One of them is simply to discard it, ignoring whatever else was on the other side of the card in order to get a new species. Very simply, you don't have to do anything else. You just take another species board, populate it with 2 more tokens to keep track of body size and population, and voila, you have a new species, which also means another mouth to feed. Next, you can discard a card in order to increase your body size. And then the third action, I'll just go ahead and say, is you can discard a card to instead increase your population. Having more population means that you have more mouths to feed, but remember that food tokens are going to get you points at the end of the game. And after you get done feeding your species, those food tokens are going to go into your bag to be collected for points. So having more population can be a very good thing. And also, if you ever run out of population, your species dies. So the more population you have, the better if there are carnivores amongst the group. Body size is important because that's going to determine how susceptible you are to being attacked by carnivores. The bigger your body size, the better, since a carnivore can only attack a species that has less body size than it does. Now, the last thing you can do with your cards is play them face down as traits. When you play it face down as a trait, that's because you are all going to flip over simultaneously, so you can't look at other players' traits that they're playing as you play, or as you go through your turns, and then decide, oh, okay, I'm going to go ahead and just play this one instead. So everyone does it face down at first, then everyone will simultaneously flip once the turns are over. Now, remember that every species can only have a total maximum of 3 trait cards out in front of them, although if you want to replace a trait card, you can. You simply get rid of the old one and replace it with the new one. But let me go ahead and show you some of the trait cards that come in the game. A lot of these are defensive cards or are going to help you get more and more food. The climbing card says that carnivores must have climbing in order to attack this species, which makes sense. The horn card says that a carnivore can attack you, but if they do so, they lose a population simply for doing so. The burrowing card says that the species can't be attacked if it has food equal to its population. So if it's a well-fed species, they can just burrow away from the carnivores. The long neck card is a beneficial card. When the food cards are revealed, you get to take a plant food from the food bank as opposed to just having to take them from the watering hole. Foraging says that every time that you take a food from the watering hole, you take an additional food token. Whenever you take food tokens, you put them on top spaces of your board. I'll get back to that. The warning call card, this is a defensive card. These arrows at the top tell you which species it affects, because when you put a new species out, as I probably should have mentioned before, you decide right then and there what side of your other species it goes to, and then it's stuck there because of cards like this. The warning call card, the carnivore must have ambush to attack your species that are adjacent to this species. Symbiosis, this species cannot be attacked if your species to the right has a larger body size than this species. Fertile, when the food cards are revealed, you increase the species population by 1 if there is food on the watering hole from the previous round. Cooperation, when this species takes food, your species to the right also takes a food from the same source. Intelligence is a bit of a funky card. You can discard this card from your hand anytime during feeding, and if you're a carnivore, you negate the trait for this species, negate a trait for this species' next attack, so you can ignore horns, for example. Or non-carnivore, you can take 2 food from the food bank. And here are those mythical carnivore cards. If you play this carnivore card, you can attack and eat other species, but you can no longer eat plant food from the watering hole ever. Pack hunting. This species' body size is equal to its population plus its body size when determining if it can attack another species, which is very, very beneficial for getting through herbivores who decide to increase their body size a lot. And the ambush card, whose sole use is to negate that warning call card that I showed you before. So those are just some examples of some of the traits you can play onto your different species. Then it gets down to feeding time. Now, I actually just remembered that I did something out of order here. Now is the time when you would actually reveal the cards that you put onto the watering hole and then populate it with food. But then it goes in turn order, and players are going to try to feed their species by either taking food from the watering hole, or if they're a carnivore, they must attack another species. Taking food from the watering hole is simple as taking it and putting it on your spot. Now, you can never have more food than the number of population that you have for an individual species, because you're just trying to feed your population. Now, if you are a carnivore and you attack another species, you reduce that species' population by 1, and then you take a carnivore food token from the supply. If you were to take the last population from a species, that species is gone and eliminated. Now the good news is that if you have a species eliminated and you had trait cards on it, you actually get to redraw cards equal to the number of trait cards you would have lost. You're going to keep going around doing this using special abilities if you can, either eating other species or taking food from the watering hole, until either every player's species are all fed, meaning that they have a number of food tokens equal to their population, or there's no more food to be had. At that point, you all have to actually feed your species with the tokens that you've accumulated. If you cannot feed every member of your species, in other words, you have less food tokens than you do have population, you lose a number of population until you equalize down to the amount of food that you have. Then every food token that was eaten by a member of your population goes into your food token bag. And that's it. You're going to keep doing that until someone has taken the last card from the deck. Or I should say, when you're dealing out cards during the normal deal phase, if the deck had to be shuffled at that point, then that is going to be the final round of the game. At the end of that round, you're going to do the end of game scoring. And actually, I misspoke earlier. It's not points equal to the number of species that you have. It's points equal to the number of population you have for each of your species. Points for all the trait cards that you have on those species. Points for all the food tokens that you have in your food token bag. And that's it. Whoever has the most points at that point is the winner of the game. Let's get to my final thoughts. Well, the first thing everyone notices about Evolution, and with good reason, is the production value, which is through the roof. It's great. I never played the original version of Evolution, and I know it was just kind of a relatively small, lackluster game as far as components go, because I saw other people playing it, and I was like, man, whatever. So for them to spin it out into this like big, grand, aesthetically pleasing game is a really great thing. Is it totally necessary, all the different components that are in there, like the boards and that? Probably not, but it looks great and it works well. It works very intuitively. Everything from the little baggies to the probably unnecessary watering hole just look fantastic out on the table. All of the artwork is just stunning. I mean, this watercolor, surrealist sort of like these crazy creatures, which are both definitely not real, but at the same time are grounded in this, very organic and natural feeling to them. That probably sounds a little pretentious, but I'm just trying to say that it really is fantastic artwork. So I don't have a complaint about the components or the artwork. It's all great. As far as the gameplay goes, well, actually, no. Let me take a step back. The theme of the game. The theme of the game is solid. I love the idea of it, of evolving creatures. I mean, it's just a fantastic idea. How it comes out through the gameplay, it does and it doesn't. At times it does, because it's like, oh, okay, you're a carnivore, you're eating population. That makes sense to me. Going to a watering hole and grabbing some plants and food, okay, fine. When it comes down to like putting out traits, sometimes that can feel a little more mechanical and methodical and somewhat drags me out of the theme, because at times it's just like, you can trade out cards. You're limited to 3, but you can trade out the evolutions that you have if you want to put out a new one, which doesn't really strike me as thematic at all. Because like, well, okay, I want to put this one here, and switch them out. And then it starts to feel much more just like a card placement game. I don't have a problem with that necessarily, and I'll say right now, I like this game quite a bit, but I do wish that the theme carried over just a little bit more. You could say that that's nitpicky. It is solid as far as the theme goes, just not quite where I would want it to be. But moving on to the gameplay and the mechanics, like I already said, I like this game. It's really, really neat, and I think that people, if you're like me, I kind of was sheltered from this game. I didn't know a ton about it. I purposely chose not to read the rules at length because I knew eventually I'd pick up the game, wasn't too worried about it. That's what reviewers think, folks. If the game seems somewhat cool, we'll get it. So I didn't know a ton about how the game was actually going to play out, but I was surprised that it is definitely a card game, but the interaction between your boards and how you manipulate those and constantly moving the token tracks back and forth for your population and body size, and also the tokens from the watering hole and how much of an impact that has on the game, it surprised me how relevant that was to it all, while at the same time being a hand management game. I was just kind of bagging on the traits aspect for the theme goes, but it is interesting how you have this limitation of the different traits and how you have to, especially if you're an herbivore, how you have to play your cards in such a way that you're going to be able to build essentially a wall of defense for all of your different creatures. All it takes is one bad egg to who becomes a carnivore to just totally jack up everyone else, and I'm happy to say that in at least one of the games I played, I was that bad egg, which is fine. And because of that, you are constantly thinking about how do I protect my species? How do I protect all of my species? And there are clearly some cards that are way better at this than others, like the alarm call or the warning shout, which can protect your other species. And when it gets down to that, then all you have to do is just find some way to protect your main species and you're good to go. But I do love the way that your placement of your species, again, even though that doesn't make a ton of thematic sense, is pretty cool and leads some more strategic thinking. Now, I have heard people complain that the whole thing with the carnivores is a bit unbalanced. I've actually heard it both ways, that the whole carnivore thing can be, they can be a bit too overpowering if you decide to go carnivore with one or more of your species. But I've also heard it the other way, where because there are so many ways for herbivores to defend themselves, once they get to that point, it can really shut down a carnivore player's options. But the thing to note here is that you can have multiple species in the game. So you can decide to have different play styles and to go in different directions, and maybe just let one of your, if your carnivore species is not doing well, just kind of let it go. Don't focus on it so much. And that's another very interesting part of the game. And actually, if one of my friends that I played this game with was really surprised at that. He's fairly new to modern board gaming in particular, but he's had some bad experiences with card games where you start the game, have some bad plays, and you are just out. Like, everyone else has snowballed way past you, and you just keep getting stomped down over and over again. In Evolution, if you lose one of your species at the beginning of the game, if you're playing for the first time, it seems devastating, but it's really not. You can come back. If you put trait cards on that species, you get to draw more cards at the end of your turn, which means you can give the species that's coming out a bigger boost, or perhaps have more species come out. That interesting dynamic that you can not be knocked too far out of the game by losing your species is great. It means that you're hurt, but it's not impossible to come back. And in fact, most games ended with someone winning who had lost multiple species during the course of the game. It just happens that way. So I really appreciate that, and I love any game, any card game that lets you use cards for multiple things. And this has that in spades. You can use it for traits. You can use it to increase your population or body mass. You can use it to increase, just discarding cards to increase your species, to have another species come out. Knowing when to do that, how to do that, what you're going to focus on. Do you just have one species and try to max them out as much as possible, or have multiple species and hope that you get the right trait cards to keep them safe long enough from the carnivores? That back and forth, and also having to use your cards in the way that you see fit, is great. That's probably my favorite individual part of the game. Now, like I said, some complaints about the game aside from the little thematic bits. I do feel, after playing this game 4 times now, I feel that it can feel a little bit, how many times do I have to say feel? It can get a little bit samey. I don't know how much more prevalent this will be over a longer period of time, and of course they are working on expansion now, but like I said, there are some cards that are clearly more powerful than others. You can say that that in and of itself might be a little bit of a complaint too, and you know that you want to go for those cards. There are obvious picks if you've played the game a couple of times, or even one time really, and seen those cards come up. And so I think that when that kind of mechanism in the game, where you're always going to go for these power cards, can lead to the game starting to feel the same, like, of course I'm going to take this card, and of course I'm going to play it like this because I got the most points last time by having this many species and maximizing their food. So it can lead to the game starting to feel a little bit too similar to each other, and I do worry about that over a long period of time. But like I said, hopefully more and more expansions could fix that, because it's very easy to do. You just add more cards to the game. That's the great thing about card games. More cards. You don't need to do big modules or fancy modules. That's all you need to do. So overall, I think it's great. I love the aesthetics of the game. I love the theme that is there, and I do enjoy the clever card play. And hey, you're making dinosaurs and giant prehistoric creatures. How can you not enjoy that? Choosing what to focus on, choosing whether to go carnivore or herbivore. These are really interesting decisions. I don't think it's the greatest card game ever, but it certainly pleasantly surprised me. That is Evolution from North Star Games.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.